In the annals of ancient history, few figures embody the treacherous complexity of political betrayal quite like Bessus, the Persian satrap whose name became synonymous with both cunning ambition and spectacular miscalculation. His story unfolds against the backdrop of Alexander the Great's relentless conquest of the Persian Empire, a tale that begins with loyalty and ends in one of the most brutal executions ever recorded in the ancient world. The narrative of Bessus serves as a masterclass in how personal ambition, when coupled with catastrophic misjudgment, can transform a powerful ruler into a hunted fugitive whose fate becomes a cautionary tale echoing through the centuries. Bessus ruled as satrap of Bactria, one of the most distant and challenging provinces of the vast Persian Empire. This region, encompassing much of modern-day Afghanistan and parts of Central Asia, was known for its harsh terrain, fierce tribal warriors, and strategic importance as a crossroads between civilizations. The landscape itself seemed designed to test human endurance, with towering mountain ranges that scraped the sky, vast steppes that stretched beyond the horizon, and river valleys that could transform from peaceful streams to raging torrents with the changing seasons. As a member of the Persian nobility and a distant relative of King Darius III, Bessus commanded considerable respect and wielded significant military power that extended far beyond the formal boundaries of his province. His province served as a crucial buffer zone against the nomadic tribes of the steppes, those restless peoples who had terrorized settled civilizations for generations with their lightning raids and tactical mobility. The Scythians, Massagettas, and other tribal confederations posed a constant threat to the stability of the Persian Empire's northeastern frontier, and it fell to Bessus to maintain the delicate balance between diplomacy and military force that kept these dangerous neighbors at bay. His ability to maintain order in such a volatile region, where the slightest miscalculation could result in devastating tribal invasions, had earned him recognition throughout the empire and the personal trust of the great king himself. The court of Bactria under Bessus's rule was a sophisticated center of Persian culture and administration, far removed from the primitive frontier outpost that outsiders might have imagined. Persian nobles, Greek merchants, Indian philosophers, and Central Asian tribal leaders mingled in his halls, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that reflected the diverse nature of his domain. Bessus himself was no mere provincial administrator, but a cultured man who spoke multiple languages, understood the intricacies of international diplomacy, and possessed the military acumen necessary to command respect from warriors who had known no master but their own tribal chiefs. When Alexander began his conquest of Persia in 334 BCE, Bessus initially remained loyal to his king, viewing the Macedonian invasion as simply another barbarian incursion that would ultimately be repelled by Persian military superiority. The early reports from the western provinces seemed to confirm this assessment, as Alexander's forces appeared small and far from their homeland, vulnerable to the kind of strategic depth that had protected Persia from previous invaders. However, as news of successive Persian defeats began to filter eastward, Bessus found himself forced to reassess both Alexander's capabilities and Darius's leadership. He witnessed the devastating defeats at Granicus, Issus, and finally Gaugamela, watching as Alexander systematically dismantled the greatest empire the world had ever known. Each victory brought the Macedonian conqueror closer to the heart of Persia, and with each defeat, the confidence in Darius's leadership began to crumble among the Persian nobility. The psychological impact of these losses cannot be overstated, as they shattered the fundamental assumption that had underpinned Persian imperial ideology for over 2 centuries, that the great king was divinely protected and militarily invincible. The Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE proved to be the final straw for many Persian nobles, including Bessus, who had traveled westward with a substantial Bactrian contingent to participate in what was supposed to be the decisive confrontation with Alexander. Despite commanding a massive army that outnumbered Alexander's forces by a considerable margin, and despite having chosen the battlefield and having months to prepare defensive positions, Darius had once again fled the battlefield when the tide turned against him. This act of cowardice, as many saw it, shattered the last vestiges of respect that the Persian nobility held for their king. Bessus, who had fought bravely in the battle and witnessed firsthand the chaos that ensued when Darius abandoned his troops began to harbor deep resentments about the king's leadership that went far beyond mere military disappointment. In his view, Darius had violated the fundamental compact between ruler and ruled, abandoning his sacred duty to lead by example and protect his followers even at the cost of his own life. The Persian military tradition, stretching back to Cyrus the Great, emphasized that kings must be first in attack and last in retreat, a principle that Darius had now violated repeatedly in the face of Alexander's advance. As Alexander pursued the fleeing Persian court eastward, a conspiracy began to form among the most powerful satraps and nobles who had survived the disaster at Gaugamela. Bessus found himself at the center of this plot, joined by Nabarzanes, the chiliarch or chief minister, whose administrative expertise had kept the empire functioning even as its military foundations crumbled, and Barsantis, the satrap of Arachosia, whose southern provinces provided crucial access to the wealth of India. These men represented the highest echelons of Persian power, and their growing disillusionment with Darius reflected a broader crisis of confidence throughout the empire. The conspirators met in secret councils as they traveled with the royal court through the eastern provinces, their conversations taking place in the pre-dawn darkness when the risk of discovery was minimal. They spoke in hushed tones about the king's repeated failures, his inability to stand and fight like a true Persian warrior, and most damaging of all, his willingness to abandon his own soldiers in the heat of battle. The discussions revealed not just personal ambition, but a genuine belief that the empire itself was doomed unless drastic action was taken to remove the source of its weakness. Bessus, with his military background and regional power base, emerged as the natural leader of this faction. He possessed both the strategic acumen necessary to plan such a dangerous undertaking and the ruthless determination required to carry out what they all knew would be an irreversible act of treason. His position as ruler of Bactria provided him with resources and manpower that the other conspirators lacked, while his reputation as a successful military commander gave him credibility among the soldiers whose support would be essential for any change of leadership. The psychological transformation of Bessus during this period reveals the complex motivations that drive political betrayal, showing how loyalty can gradually erode under the pressure of repeated disappointments and perceived betrayals. He had served the Persian crown faithfully for decades, building his reputation as a capable administrator and skilled military commander who had never given his superiors cause to doubt his commitment to the empire. Yet the repeated humiliations suffered under Darius's leadership had gradually eroded his loyalty, replacing it with a burning ambition to save what remained of Persian dignity and power. In his mind, removing Darius was not an act of treason, but rather a desperate attempt to preserve the empire from complete destruction at the hands of a king who seemed incapable of rising to meet the greatest challenge in Persian history. Bessus convinced himself that he was acting not out of personal ambition, but from a sense of duty to the Persian people and their ancient traditions, a rationalization that allowed him to proceed with plans that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. As the royal entourage moved deeper into the eastern provinces, passing through landscapes that became increasingly familiar to Bessus as they approached his own territorial base, the conspirators refined their plan with meticulous attention to detail. They would arrest Darius at a moment when his guard was down, remove him from power through either forced abdication or more permanent means, and then present themselves to Alexander as the new leadership of Persia. The timing would be crucial, as they needed to act before Darius could reach territories where his personal loyalty remained strong, but not so early that Alexander might interpret their action as mere opportunism. Bessus believed that by demonstrating their willingness to eliminate the primary obstacle to peace, they could negotiate favorable terms with the Macedonian conqueror that would preserve Persian autonomy within a broader imperial framework. This calculation, which seemed logical given Alexander's previous treatment of cooperative local rulers, would prove to be one of the most catastrophic misjudgments in ancient history. Bessus had fundamentally misunderstood Alexander's character, mistaking pragmatic flexibility for moral indifference, and failing to recognize the Macedonian king's deep commitment to concepts of legitimate authority and honorable warfare. The opportunity presented itself in the summer of 330 BCE as the Persian court retreated through the region of Hyrcania, a province known for its dense forests and humid climate that provided a stark contrast to the arid landscapes of the central plateau. Darius, increasingly isolated and dependent on his remaining loyal followers, had little choice but to trust the very men who were plotting his downfall. The irony of the situation was not lost on the conspirators, who found themselves in the position of protecting the king they intended to betray until the moment was right to strike. The psychological tension during this period must have been extraordinary, as Bessus and his fellow conspirators maintained the facade of loyalty while internally preparing for an act that would forever change the course of history. They attended daily councils with Darius, offered advice on military strategy, and participated in the ceremonial functions that maintained the dignity of the royal court, all while knowing that they were planning to end the Achaemenid dynasty that had ruled Persia for over 2 centuries. On a sweltering day in July, as the royal caravan made its way through the desolate landscape near the modern city of Damghan in northern Iran, Bessus and his co-conspirators made their move with the precision of a military operation. The details of the assassination itself remain somewhat disputed among ancient sources, but the general sequence of events is clear enough to reconstruct the basic outline of this pivotal moment in ancient history. The conspirators approached Darius under the pretense of discussing military strategy, their manner giving no hint of the violence they were about to unleash. The king, exhausted by months of retreat and demoralized by his repeated defeats, was probably relieved to see his most powerful remaining supporters approaching with what appeared to be new proposals for resistance against Alexander. Instead, they suddenly turned on him with weapons drawn, their faces transformed from masks of loyalty into expressions of deadly determination. The actual killing was swift and brutal, carried out by men who had served Darius faithfully for years, but who had now convinced themselves that his death was necessary for the survival of their civilization. The moment of the assassination marked a point of no return for Bessus that went far beyond the immediate political consequences. As he looked down at the body of the man who had been his king, he must have felt a complex mixture of satisfaction at having finally acted decisively, horror at the magnitude of what he had just done, and anticipation for the negotiations with Alexander that would determine whether his gamble had been worth the ultimate price he had paid. The deed was done, and now everything depended on Alexander's reaction to this dramatic gesture. Bessus ordered that Darius's body be treated with respect, understanding that the manner of the king's death would be crucial to his future negotiations with Alexander. The corpse was wrapped in royal garments and placed in a wagon that would accompany the conspirators as they prepared to make contact with the Macedonian forces. This attention to ceremonial detail reflected Bessus's belief that he could present the assassination as a regrettable necessity rather than a base act of treachery, a distinction that he hoped would influence Alexander's response. The conspirators immediately began to implement the next phase of their plan with the same methodical approach they had used in planning the assassination itself. Bessus proclaimed himself the new king of kings, taking the throne name Artaxerxes V, in deliberate evocation of the great Persian rulers of the past, while simultaneously preparing to approach Alexander with news of Darius's death and offers of cooperation. In his mind, this dual strategy would position him as both a legitimate ruler in his own right and a valuable ally to the Macedonian conqueror. The logic seemed sound from Bessus's perspective, and the execution appeared flawless in its attention to both Persian precedent and practical politics. Yet Bessus had fundamentally misunderstood the character and motivations of Alexander the Great, failing to recognize that the Macedonian king's worldview was shaped by Greek concepts of honor and legitimate warfare that would make him view regicide not as a political convenience, but as a moral abomination demanding severe punishment. When news of Darius's assassination reached Alexander, who was pursuing the Persian court with characteristic relentless determination, his reaction was immediate and explosive, revealing depths of moral outrage that surprised even his closest advisors. Rather than gratitude for the elimination of his primary rival, Alexander felt profound anger at what he saw as a base act of treachery that violated every principle of honorable warfare. The messenger who brought the news found himself facing a commander whose fury was so intense that those present feared for the man's safety. Alexander's anger stemmed from multiple sources that reflected both his personal character and his broader political philosophy. First, he had genuine respect for Darius as a fellow king and worthy opponent, despite their enmity on the battlefield. The Persian king had shown courage in previous encounters, and Alexander believed that regicide was beneath the dignity of noble warfare. This was not mere sentiment, but a deeply held conviction that kings, regardless of their nationality or the circumstances of their conflict, deserved to meet their fate in battle rather than through assassination. Second, Alexander saw himself as the legitimate successor to the Persian throne through conquest, and Darius's assassination by his own nobles threatened to undermine the very concept of legitimate royal authority that Alexander needed to maintain his rule over the vast territories he had conquered. If Persian nobles could murder their king with impunity, what precedent did that set for the stability of royal authority throughout the empire? The implications were deeply troubling for a conqueror who needed to establish lasting institutions rather than merely achieving temporary military dominance. Most importantly, Alexander recognized that allowing regicide to go unpunished would set a dangerous precedent that could eventually threaten his own position. If Persian nobles could murder their king with impunity, what would prevent them from doing the same to him once he had established himself as their new ruler? The assassination of Darius thus represented not just a personal affront, but a direct challenge to the stability of Alexander's emerging empire that demanded the most severe response possible. When Bessus's emissaries arrived at Alexander's camp, bearing the news of Darius's death and offering their master's alliance, they were met with a reception far different from what they had anticipated. These men, carefully chosen for their diplomatic skills and their ability to present complex political arguments, had prepared elaborate speeches about removing obstacles to peace and creating opportunities for cooperation between the new Persian leadership and Alexander's administration. Instead, they found themselves facing a commander whose rage made rational discourse nearly impossible. Alexander listened to their carefully prepared speeches with growing fury, his face darkening as they described Darius's death and Bessus's assumption of royal authority. When they had finished their presentation, expecting negotiations to begin, Alexander's response was swift and uncompromising. He declared Bessus a regicide and a traitor, placing a massive bounty on his head that exceeded the annual revenues of entire provinces, and vowing to pursue him to the ends of the earth with the same relentless determination that had brought him victory over the entire Persian Empire. The transformation of Bessus from potential ally to most wanted enemy happened in a matter of hours, demonstrating how completely he had misjudged Alexander's character and priorities. The man who had believed himself clever enough to manipulate the greatest conqueror in history suddenly found himself the target of Alexander's legendary wrath, with all the resources of the Macedonian war machine now focused on his capture and punishment. The psychological impact of this reversal cannot be overstated. As Bessus had gambled everything on his assessment of Alexander's response and had been catastrophically wrong, as word spread throughout the eastern provinces that Alexander had declared Bessus an enemy rather than embracing him as an ally, the political landscape shifted dramatically in ways that further undermined the former satrap's position. Many of the nobles who had supported, or at least tolerated, the conspiracy began to distance themselves from Bessus, recognizing that association with him now meant certain death at the hands of a conqueror who had never shown mercy to those who crossed him. The network of alliances and loyalties that Bessus had carefully cultivated over decades began to crumble almost overnight. Bessus retreated to his stronghold in Bactria, but he was no longer the confident satrap who had orchestrated the assassination of his king. He was now a desperate fugitive, hunted by the most successful military commander in history and abandoned by many of his former allies who had once competed for his favor. The transformation was complete, and the stage was set for one of the most relentless pursuits in ancient history, a campaign that would test the limits of human endurance and demonstrate the lengths to which Alexander would go to punish those who violated his conception of legitimate authority. Alexander's pursuit of Bessus became a defining obsession that would consume nearly 2 years of his life and push his army to the very limits of endurance, transforming what had begun as a conventional military campaign into something approaching a personal vendetta. The hunt began immediately after Alexander discovered Darius's body, which had been abandoned by the conspirators in their hasty retreat. The Macedonian king's grief and rage at finding his rival dead by treachery rather than honorable combat only intensified his determination to bring Bessus to justice, regardless of the cost in time, resources, or human lives. The geography of the pursuit presented extraordinary challenges that tested even Alexander's legendary military capabilities and forced him to develop entirely new approaches to warfare in some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. Bactria and the surrounding regions comprised some of the most challenging landscape in the ancient world, featuring towering mountain ranges that rose above the clouds, vast deserts where water sources were separated by days of travel, and river systems that could become raging torrents or dry beds, depending on the season and the distant melting of mountain snows. The local population, while nominally subject to Persian rule, maintained fierce independence and possessed intimate knowledge of the landscape that gave them significant advantages over foreign invaders. These were peoples who had resisted conquest for generations, who knew every hidden path through the mountains and every source of water in the deserts, and who could disappear into terrain that seemed incapable of supporting human life. Their loyalty to Bessus was questionable, but their hostility to foreign invaders was absolute and uncompromising. Bessus understood that his survival depended on exploiting these geographical advantages to the fullest extent possible. Drawing on tactical knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Central Asian warfare, he abandoned the conventional Persian approach of meeting enemies in large set-piece battles, instead adopting guerrilla tactics that had been perfected by the nomadic tribes of Central Asia over centuries of conflict with settled civilizations. His strategy involved drawing Alexander's forces deeper into hostile territory while avoiding direct confrontation, hoping to exhaust the Macedonian army through constant harassment and the challenges of maintaining supply lines across vast distances. The campaign began with Alexander's characteristic speed and decisiveness, as he divided his forces into multiple columns to cover more territory and prevent Bessus from consolidating his position in any single location. The main body of the army, led by Alexander himself, pushed directly into Bactria along the most direct route, while smaller detachments secured key passes and river crossings that could serve as escape routes for the fugitive satrap. This multi-pronged approach reflected Alexander's understanding that conventional pursuit tactics would be insufficient against an enemy who possessed both local knowledge and the mobility that came from traveling light. Bessus's initial response demonstrated both his military acumen and his growing desperation as he found himself forced to fight a defensive campaign against an enemy whose resources far exceeded his own. He implemented a scorched earth policy throughout his former satrapy, destroying crops that could feed Alexander's army, poisoning wells that could provide water for men and horses, and evacuating populations that might provide aid to the advancing Macedonian forces. This strategy, while militarily sound, had the unintended consequence of turning many of his own former subjects against him, as they suffered the consequences of his defensive measures. The first major engagement occurred near the Oxus River, where Bessus had positioned a substantial force to contest Alexander's crossing and hopefully inflict significant casualties on the Macedonian army while it was most vulnerable. However, when Alexander's advance guard approached the river and began reconnaissance for crossing points, Bessus once again demonstrated the tactical flexibility that had kept him alive thus far. Rather than risk a direct battle that he was likely to lose given Alexander's superior numbers and equipment, he ordered his forces to harass the Macedonian troops during the crossing attempt while avoiding decisive engagement. Alexander's response to these tactics revealed both his adaptability as a commander and his growing frustration with his elusive quarry, as he found himself forced to fight a type of war for which his training and experience had not fully prepared him. He ordered the construction of makeshift bridges and rafts using materials gathered from the surrounding countryside, while simultaneously sending cavalry units upstream and downstream to locate alternative crossing points that might allow him to outflank Bessus's defensive positions. The crossing of the Oxus became a masterpiece of military engineering and logistics, but it cost precious time and resources that Alexander could ill afford in such a remote theater of operations. Once across the Oxus, Alexander found himself in a landscape that seemed designed by hostile gods to frustrate conventional military operations and test the endurance of even the most experienced soldiers. The terrain alternated between barren steppes that offered no concealment for approaching forces and rugged mountains that channeled movement along predictable routes where ambushes could be easily arranged by defenders with local knowledge. Bessus exploited these conditions ruthlessly, appearing with his forces when Alexander's army was most vulnerable and melting away before the Macedonians could bring their superior discipline and equipment to bear in decisive combat. The psychological warfare between hunter and hunted became as important as the physical campaign, as both leaders sought to undermine their opponent's support while maintaining the morale of their own followers. Alexander made a point of treating captured followers of Bessus with clemency, offering pardons and rewards to those who would abandon their former leader and provide information about his movements and plans. This policy had the dual benefit of undermining Bessus's support network while demonstrating Alexander's confidence in his eventual victory and his ability to reward those who chose the winning side. Bessus countered these efforts by spreading rumors about Alexander's true intentions, claiming that the Macedonian king planned to enslave all the peoples of Central Asia and destroy their traditional way of life once he had eliminated all potential sources of resistance. These propaganda efforts had some success among populations that had no direct experience with Alexander's administration, but they were undermined by the reality of Alexander's relatively benevolent treatment of conquered peoples in other parts of his empire. As winter approached, both armies faced the challenge of maintaining operations in one of the harshest climates on Earth, where the margin for error was measured in hours rather than days. The steppes of Central Asia were notorious for their brutal winters, with temperatures dropping far below freezing and winds that could kill exposed men in minutes. Alexander's army, despite their experience in diverse climates from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Afghanistan, struggled with the extreme conditions and the constant threat of frostbite and hypothermia that claimed lives even when no enemy action was involved. Bessus, with his intimate knowledge of the region and its seasonal patterns, attempted to use winter as an ally in his fight for survival. He established a network of hidden supply caches and safe houses that would allow his forces to remain active even during the worst weather, while hoping that Alexander would be forced to suspend operations until spring and give him time to rebuild his strength and gather new allies. This calculation proved partially correct, as Alexander did establish winter quarters for the main body of his army, but the Macedonian king refused to completely halt his pursuit. Throughout the winter months, Alexander maintained pressure on Bessus through a series of smaller operations designed to prevent his enemy from consolidating power or gathering strength for a spring offensive. Elite units of Macedonian cavalry and light infantry, equipped with winter gear and accompanied by local guides who had been won over to Alexander's cause, continued to hunt for Bessus across the frozen landscape. These operations were extraordinarily dangerous and costly in terms of both men and resources, but they served the crucial purpose of denying Bessus any respite from the relentless pursuit. The psychological toll on both leaders became increasingly apparent as the campaign dragged on through the winter months and into the following spring, testing their resolve and their ability to maintain the loyalty of their followers. Alexander, accustomed to swift victories and decisive battles that resolved conflicts within months or even weeks, found himself engaged in a type of warfare that seemed to offer no clear path to resolution. His frustration manifested in increasingly harsh measures against populations suspected of supporting Bessus, creating a cycle of violence that made the eventual pacification of the region even more difficult. Bessus faced even greater psychological pressure as his situation became increasingly desperate and his options continued to narrow with each passing month. The man who had once ruled one of the largest and most important provinces of the Persian Empire, now found himself reduced to the life of a fugitive, constantly looking over his shoulder and never certain who among his remaining followers might be planning to betray him for Alexander's substantial reward. The stress of command under such circumstances began to show in his decision-making as he became more erratic and suspicious of even his closest allies. The turning point in the campaign came with the arrival of spring and Alexander's decision to intensify his pursuit through a strategy of systematic elimination of Bessus's support network. Recognizing that direct pursuit had proven insufficient to corner his elusive enemy, rather than continuing to chase the fugitive satrap directly, Alexander began to focus on capturing or killing the secondary leaders who provided Bessus with intelligence, supplies, and safe havens. This approach proved devastatingly effective, as it forced Bessus to expend increasing amounts of time and energy protecting his remaining allies rather than planning offensive operations. One by one, Bessus's key supporters were eliminated through a combination of military action, bribery, and psychological warfare that demonstrated Alexander's mastery of all aspects of a regular conflict. Alexander's intelligence network, built through a combination of local informants and captured prisoners who had been convinced to cooperate, provided increasingly accurate information about Bessus's movements and plans. The net was closing with mathematical precision, and both hunter and hunted could sense that the endgame was approaching. The final phase of the pursuit began when Spitamines, one of Bessus's most important allies and a powerful noble in his own right, made the calculation that continued resistance was futile and that his own survival depended on abandoning his former leader. Rather than face certain death alongside Bessus, Spitamines opened secret negotiations with Alexander's representatives, offering to deliver his former ally in exchange for guarantees of safety and continued authority over his own territories. The betrayal of Bessus by Spitamines represented the ultimate irony of the entire saga, demonstrating how the cycle of treachery that Bessus had initiated with his assassination of Darius had now come full circle to destroy him. The man who had gained power through the assassination of his own king now found himself abandoned by his closest ally, who was willing to commit precisely the same act of treachery that Bessus himself had perpetrated against Darius. The precedent that Bessus had established was now being used against him with devastating effectiveness. When Spitamines' messengers arrived at Alexander's camp with the offer to deliver Bessus, the Macedonian king's response was immediate and decisive, revealing his eagerness to finally bring this long pursuit to a conclusion. He agreed to the terms of the betrayal, while simultaneously beginning preparations for what he intended to be a spectacular demonstration of justice that would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider regicide as a political option. The actual capture of Bessus occurred with anticlimactic swiftness after nearly 2 years of relentless pursuit that had tested the limits of human endurance and military capability. Spitamines lured his former ally into a trap under the pretense of planning a major offensive against Alexander's forces, then had him bound and delivered to the Macedonians like a piece of cargo. The mighty satrap who had once commanded armies and ruled over vast territories was reduced to a helpless prisoner, his fate entirely in the hands of the man he had sought to manipulate and ultimately defied. Alexander's treatment of the captured Bessus was designed to send a message that would resonate throughout his empire and beyond, demonstrating that certain crimes against legitimate authority would be punished with a severity that would be remembered for generations. Rather than ordering a quick execution, which would have been the conventional fate for a captured enemy, Alexander chose to subject Bessus to a form of punishment that was both symbolically significant and physically horrific. The method of execution he selected reflected both Greek concepts of justice and Persian traditions of royal punishment, creating a spectacle that would be remembered and discussed throughout the ancient world. The preliminary humiliations began immediately upon Bessus's arrival at Alexander's camp, as the Macedonian king sought to strip away every vestige of the dignity and authority that the former satrap had once possessed. Bessus was stripped of his royal garments and dressed in the rags of a common criminal, then paraded before the assembled army while heralds proclaimed his crimes against both Darius and the concept of legitimate kingship. This public degradation served multiple purposes, demonstrating Alexander's power over his enemies while reinforcing the message that regicide would not be tolerated under any circumstances. The formal trial of Bessus, while predetermined in its outcome, provided Alexander with an opportunity to articulate his philosophy of kingship and justice before an audience that included not only his own soldiers, but also representatives from throughout his empire. Alexander served as both prosecutor and judge, delivering a lengthy speech that detailed Bessus's crimes and explained why they demanded the most severe punishment available under both Greek and Persian law. The trial became a theatrical performance designed to educate as much as to punish. The charges against Bessus were comprehensive and damning, covering not only his specific actions but also their broader implications for the stability of legitimate government. He was accused of regicide, treason against his lawful king, violation of his oath of loyalty as a satrap, and most seriously, the crime of hubris in assuming royal titles and prerogatives to which he had no legitimate claim. Each charge carried the death penalty under the legal traditions of both cultures, but Alexander made it clear that the combination of these offenses demanded something far more severe than a simple execution. The method of execution that Alexander ultimately chose reflected his desire to create a punishment that would be both personally satisfying and politically effective in deterring future acts of rebellion. Bessus was to be torn apart by being tied to two trees that were bent down and then released, allowing the natural spring of the wood to literally rip his body in half. This method, known as sparagmos, was considered one of the most horrific forms of execution available in the ancient world, reserved for only the most heinous crimes and designed to serve as a deterrent to others who might consider similar offenses. The execution itself was carried out with elaborate ceremony designed to maximize its impact on witnesses and ensure that the lesson would be transmitted throughout Alexander's vast empire. Representatives from throughout the known world were invited to observe the proceedings, ensuring that news of Bessus's fate would spread quickly to every corner of the civilized world. The symbolism was unmistakable. Alexander's justice was swift, certain, and terrible in its application to those who dared to challenge legitimate royal authority. As the trees were bent and prepared for the final act, Bessus faced his fate with a mixture of defiance and resignation that reflected the complex character that had driven him to both greatness and destruction. The man who had once believed himself clever enough to manipulate history's greatest conqueror now confronted the ultimate consequence of his miscalculation. His final words, according to the ancient sources, were a mixture of curses against his betrayers and expressions of regret for the path that had led him to this moment. The actual moment of execution was swift but horrific, as the released trees tore Bessus's body apart with a violence that shocked even the battle-hardened soldiers who witnessed it. The message was unmistakable. This was the fate that awaited anyone who dared to raise their hand against legitimate royal authority. Alexander had achieved his goal of creating a spectacle that would be remembered and feared throughout his empire and beyond. The aftermath of Bessus's execution resonated far beyond the immediate political and military consequences, becoming a defining moment in the establishment of Alexander's imperial ideology. The story became a cautionary tale that was told and retold throughout the ancient world, serving as a powerful reminder of the dangers inherent in political betrayal and the lengths to which rulers would go to protect the concept of legitimate authority. The brutal end of the man who had once ruled Bactria became a cornerstone of Hellenistic political theory, demonstrating both the necessity of harsh punishment for certain crimes and the theatrical dimension of royal justice. The legacy of Bessus extends far beyond his role as a footnote in Alexander's conquests, serving as a case study in the psychology of political ambition and the dangers of miscalculating the character of one's opponents. His story illuminates the complex dynamics of loyalty, ambition, and political calculation that shaped the ancient world, while providing insights into the psychological factors that drive individuals to make decisions that ultimately seal their own fate. The rise and fall of this Persian satrap serves as a timeless reminder that in the dangerous game of politics and power, miscalculation can have consequences that extend far beyond anything the players originally imagined, and that the pursuit of power through treachery often leads to destruction by the very same means.